Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last installment of Portrait of a Lady. So, instead of beginning with the critic du jour, I'm going to end with the critic du jour because I don't want to give away too much of the plot. So we're going to start right off with the text, page 528, which I'm pretty sure that's where we left off, but I'm never sure. So, if we go to page 528, there's an important point made by Henrietta. Remember that Henrietta is from the United States. She is the new liberal woman. She's freer than Isabel seems to be. And she says right on page 528, leave your husband before the worst comes. That's what I want you to promise. Interesting. She says, and Isabel says in response, the worst? What do you call the worst? Before your character gets spoiled. And all along, Henrietta has been saying that Isabel's character is going to be ruined by Osmond. Down at the bottom, Henrietta says, last paragraph, as if she were beginning an argument, nothing is more common in our western cities, and it is to them, after all, that we must look in the future, as though America chronicles or offers the newest way of seeing things. And that is one of the themes in the whole book, this contrast between Europe and America, between the old Europe and new America. And in that, we see also the contrast between what James feared was corrupt in Europe and fresh in America. And here we have this passage about divorce. What do I have here? I have so much material. We can't possibly get through everything, but it's very interesting because this critic says, and who was this one? I forget. This is Melissa Gans, and she's from 19th century literature criticism. It's a critical essay. All right. She says the novel then is simultaneously attracted to and troubled by the idea that unhappy spouses might turn to the law for relief. Right out of this book. Portrait places great importance on emotional happiness and compatibility in conjugal life. James vividly depicts the psychological costs of Isabel's miserable marriage, bringing them sharply into focus and insisting that her mental anguish matters. He suggests, too, that strict divorce laws do not prevent unhappy couples from working out their own solutions to their marital troubles and even violating their vows. James is keenly aware of the psychological costs of remaining in a miserable union, but he is also deeply concerned about the moral and social implications of liberal divorce laws. The novel struggles to resolve the tension between the liberal and the conservative positions in the divorce debates, attempting to adjudicate the competing claims of the individual versus society. So, in the end, the concerns of society trump those of the individual. Isabel does not follow Henrietta's advice and turn to America's liberal divorce courts to dissolve her unhappy union with Osmond. I think I need to pause here for a second. Yeah, we'll come back to that. So if we look back on page 528, we have liberal Henrietta offering this option. Dump him. Get rid of him. You have money. We look over on 529. She says at the bottom, yes, it's a generous one, and it makes me deeply ashamed. I ought to go with you, you know. She says, your husband wouldn't like that. Oh, Ralph says that. Yeah. And we know that her husband doesn't like it. He's not a nice guy. There's nothing appealing about Osmond. He's just a portrait of what he thinks is visible. If we look over on page 530, she admits, it isn't that I am afraid, said Isabel. After a pause, she repeated, as if to make herself, rather than him, hear the words, I am afraid. She says, or he says, this is Ralph, afraid of your husband, he said. And she says, afraid of myself. If I were afraid of my husband, that would simply be my duty. That is what women are expected to be. A few lines later, oh, my dear Isabel, Ralph answered, he's used to that. There is nothing left for Mr. Goodwood. So we see this is maybe the best denouement I've ever read in my life. Um, I remember that when I read this book for the first time in graduate school, first time, I thought this was maybe the best book I'd ever read. And then when we covered it again a number of years ago, and I forget when, I think Jane told me, but I forgot. I again believed that this is the best denouement I've ever read. I was sitting in the jail classroom reading the book, because our numbers are way down. Um, and thinking that this is so compelling, I cannot stop reading. Um, if you look over on page 531, middle of that bigger paragraph at the top, Osmond's face wore a sharp, aggressive smile. He was like a man whose perceptions had been quickened by good news. And at the end of the paragraph, there was something very refreshing to an inveterate Italian like himself in talking with a genuine outsider. Um, and we see this repeatedly in the conversations between Isabel and Osmond, that how mean spirited he is, and it's interesting to note how James is able to convey the meanness in their conversations. So if we look over on page 532, Goodwood appears again. He comes in and out in this end of the novel. At the top of page 533, Goodwood, he accepted him, Goodwood accepted Osmond as a rather brilliant personage of the amateurish kind, afflicted with a redundancy of leisure, which it amused him to work off in little refinements of conversation. It's interesting because James kind of needles Osmond about having too much leisure time, whereas um, Goodwood has made his own way, and quite the American way, by working, by creating a factory. But he only half trusted him. He could never make out why the deuce Osmond should lavish refinements of any sort upon him. And then a few lines later. Now remember, we're in some of these very deep paragraphs from James, and whenever you see these very, very long paragraphs, he is revealing to us something about people's character. Um, let's see, mid paragraph. It was true that Goodwood at times had wished Osmond were dead and would have liked to kill him. But Osmond had no means of knowing this, for practice had made Goodwood quite perfect in the art of appearing inaccessible today to any violent emotion. He cultivated this art in order to deceive himself, but it was others that he deceived first. We're going to see that characteristic in Goodwood all the way from now until the end, that he's able to maintain a facade of, of impassiveness, even though he's quite worried. Worried would not be the right word. Quite worried about Isabel and his connection to her. Down at the bottom of page 533. He was more careful, he meaning Osmond, he was more careful than ever to speak as if he and his wife had all things in sweet community, and it were as natural to each of them to say we as to say I. Oh, I thought that was really, really clever because Osmond now, outside of his conversations with Isabel, refers to their relationship as we. Oh, just so brilliant. In all this, there was an air of intention which puzzled and angered our poor Bostonian, meaning Goodwood. But you look on the next page, 534. Whatever could be done to improve it, the most useful form of assistance would not be to inflame her former lovers with a sense of her wrongs. Um, that's in reference to Henrietta. She is quite insightful, and she knows that it's not a good idea to upset Isabel's relationship with Osmond. She knows that's going to cause Isabel trouble. If we look at the top of page 535, Osmond, let's see, Goodwood was vaguely aware that he was touching again upon this perfect intimacy with his wife, the we. It's possessive. I just thought that was really curious um, that Osmond had utilized this as a way to create the image of us versus everyone else. It seemed to him for a moment that Osmond had a kind of demonic imagination. It was impossible that without malice he should have selected so unusual a topic. But what did it matter after all, whether he were demonic or not, whether she loved him or hated him? She might hate him to the death, without Goodwood's gaining by it. So, as I said, uh, Osmond is creating this image of us by using those pronouns. And then we go down to the bottom of page 535. Is that? Yeah, 535. You see, being married is in itself an occupation. It isn't always active, it's often passive, but that takes even more attention. Then my wife and I do so many things together. We read, we study, we make music, we walk, we drive, we eat, talk even, as when we first knew each other. I delight to this hour in my wife's conversation. That's just baloney. And yet, that's the image he's trying to create for Goodwood, almost. And the narrator tells us it's demonic in his intent. If we look over on page 536, um, mid page, there was something perverse in the inveteracy with which she avoided him. Goodwood's unquenchable rancor discovered an intention where there was certainly no appearance of one. So Goodwood is able to see beneath the facade that Isabel is trying to create. Isabel is not letting go, really, of her commitment to Osmond. And remember, we saw this last week. She knew that by now she knows that she has made an error, and she can justify why she made that error, which was that she did it intentionally with the right intentions. But it turned out that Osmond had deceived her. On page 537, um, the Countess appears. She's an interesting character. She appears mid-page 537. They went together, leaving the Countess with her little circle, and for a moment they had crossed the threshold. Neither of them spoke. This is Isabel and Goodwood. Now that he was alone with her, all the passion that he had never stifled surged into his senses. So we know that Goodwood is still enamored of, still in love with Isabel, and he reappears frequently, especially at the end. If we look on page 538, at the top of the, about a quarter of the page, Casper broke out, I don't care a straw for your cousin. Is that what you wished to tell me? No, I didn't want to tell you anything. I wanted to ask you, what have you really made of your life? that echoes what Ralph wondered at the beginning of the novel. What is she going to do with herself? He says, Casper goes on, I can't understand. I can't penetrate you. What am I to believe? What do you want me to think? And I am told you are unhappy, and if you are, I should not like to know it. A few lines later, you are completely changed. You conceal everything. I haven't really come near you. And that is pretty much what we are seeing in her. Um, she had to create a facade that doesn't reveal her unhappiness because her unhappiness, she's stuck with it. She made the decision without being pressured anywhere, or at least so she thought. Um, so he asks her, and yet I don't touch you. I want to know the truth. Have you done well? And she says, you ask a great deal. And then, as with many places in the notes, there's references to Tennyson. And remember that Tennyson is a romantic poet who often talked about love. And there's another reference here in the next paragraph. I'll let you read those notes. If we look at the top of page 539, I want to go to Siberia tomorrow. Why do you want me to leave the place? You must have some reason for that. If you were as contented as you pretend to be, you wouldn't care. I would rather know the truth about you, even if it's damnable, than have come here for nothing. He keeps pushing her because he's still in love with her. What I tell you, when I tell you I love you, it's simply what I came for. And then at the end of the paragraph on 539, he tells me you adore each other. You just, that Osmond just is so, he's so evil. Um, I'm sure you got to be invested in these characters the way I have. And Osmond is a fictional character, and yet I really, really dislike him. At the end of this paragraph, yes, you have something to hide. It's none of my business, very true. But I love you, says Casper. Oh, it almost makes you cry. And you think back, and we're going to see a reference to this. You think back, and she had Mrs. Touchette not gone to Boston and visited Isabel, she might have married Casper. And remember that the whole point of the novel is an investigation of the possibilities. So if we look down at the bottom of 539, Casper says, let's see, is this Casper? Yes. But you can't help it, of course not. You would if you could, but you can't, unfortunately. Unfortunately for me, I mean. I ask nothing, nothing that is that I shouldn't, but I do ask one sole satisfaction that you tell me, that I tell you what, she says, whether I may pity you. He keeps trying to get her to admit it, and she won't. If we look at the top of page 540, she raised her fan to her face, which it covered, all except her eyes. They rested a moment on his. Don't give your life to it, but give a thought to it every now and then. And with that, Isabel went back to the Countess Gemini. So, without admitting it, she silently conveys to Casper that there's truth to what he's asking, and that is that she's unhappy. Casper has heard that she's unhappy from Henrietta, and he can see that she's now all closed up. He used to have great conversations with her, with Isabel, and that is no longer possible. In the next chapter, page 541, we see Madame Merrill. And I'm sure that you have figured out that Madame Merrill and Osmond know each other in a way that is more obvious than it had been. There is something about the two of them that is very similar. They have similar takes on life. So here she is. Madame Merrill, this is the middle of the page. Madame Merrill bent her head on one side a little, protestingly, and smiled in the left corner of her mouth. I can't even do it. Is this left? Yeah, that's left. Um, Something weird about her smile. Um, she says at the bottom of the page, "How you say that? Don't you know I had set my heart on it?" Madame Merrill asked with a great deal of spirit, but still with an intonation of good humor. Like Osmond, she has nearly a perfect facade, but she lets down her guard just a little bit here, and insisting that she had set her heart on a good marriage for Pansy. Now remember, Pansy is almost a non person. She is so controlled by her father. And so it appears that Madame Merrill has had a hand in this as well. She had her heart set on a good marriage with Lord Warburton. Warburton. I've had trouble with that all along. Um, Isabel says to her, "You'd better ask Pansy about it." Pansy didn't want to marry the Lord W. Those words seemed to justify the impulse of self defense aroused on Isabel's part by her perceiving that her visitor's attitude was a critical one. A few lines later, for she had a dangerous quickness in her eye and an air of irritation with which even her admirable smile was not able to transmute. She's got an impenetrable facade. She meaning Madame Merrill. A few lines later, middle of the page, she was nearer to her than Isabel had yet discovered, and her nearness was not the charming accident that she had so long thought. The sense of accident, indeed, had died within her that day when she had happened to be struck with the manner in which Madame Merrill and her own husband sat together in private. James takes us back to that moment repeatedly when Isabel determines that there is something between her husband and Madame Merrill. She hasn't quite figured out what it is. Don't forget that last week we also saw that um, Isabel sees something corrupt in the people around her in Rome. She says that they were tainted and somehow dirty because they were behaving badly. Like the Countess, she steps out all the time. What the heck? She's bad marriage. A few lines later, there was more intention in her past behavior than she had allowed for at the time. Ah, yes, there had been intention. There had been intention. Something wrong with that incident. What was it that brought it home to her that Madame Merrill's intention had not been good? Nothing but the mistrust which had lately taken body, and which married itself now to the fruitful wonder produced by her visitor's challenge on behalf of poor Pansy. Something. Now, when I read this past summer, I had forgotten in the 10 years that I hadn't read this, I had forgotten how this unfolded. I had forgotten what the intention was. If we look over the top of page 543, she moved quickly indeed, and with reason, for a strange truth was filtering into her soul. Madame Merrill's interest was identical with Osmond's. That was enough. So that's one of those places that needs a star. Something about their connection. At the bottom of this, page 543, your husband judges you severely. Isabel made for a moment no answer to this. She felt choked with bitterness. It was not the insolence of Madame Merrill's informing her that Osmond had been taking her into his confidence as against his wife that struck her most. For she has not, no, she was not quick to believe that this was meant for insolence. End of the paragraph. What touched Isabel like a drop of corrosive acid upon an open wound was the knowledge that Osmond dishonored her in his words as well as his thoughts. You can imagine how angry she was. Madame Isabel thought Madame Merrill disagreeable. That's quite a change. Remember that um, Isabel had really invested a lot in her friendship with Madame Merrill, and then all of a sudden she sees that there's something, an intention that she doesn't quite understand. Mid-paragraph or mid-page, page 544. What truth do you speak of? Isabel asked, wondering. Just this. Whether Lord Warburton changed his mind quite of his own movement, or because you recommended it. To please himself, I mean, or to please you. There's something really insidious about Madame Merrill's suggesting that Isabel would have been jealous of Lord Warburton if Lord W, that's easier for me to say, had married Pansy. Madame Merrill suggesting that Isabel rejected that because she didn't want to let go of Warburton for Pansy. And oh, there's just something so corrosive about this at the bottom of page 544, but that doesn't alter the fact that it would make a difference in his view of his daughter's prospects to know distinctly what really occurred. And I'm sure you were wondering, why is it that Madame Merrill has so much invested in this? Let him off. Let us have him. What? Let us have him? Remember, 10 minutes ago, I was emphasizing Osmond's use of the pronoun we. And here it is again from Madame Merrill. Let him off. Let us have him. Let us have Warburton for Pansy. And Isabel says, who are you? What are you? What have you to do with my husband? We don't know yet, do we? End of the page. Page 544, 45. You can see that I'm looking over to see what Daphne's doing. She's chewing on something, and I don't want her to be chewing on her hands. Okay, she stopped. Bottom of the page. She had long before this taken old Rome into her confidence, for in a world of ruins, the ruin of her happiness seemed a less unnatural catastrophe. She rested her weariness upon things that had crumbled for centuries, and yet still were upright. She dropped her secret sadness into the silence of lonely places, where its very modern quality detached itself and grew objective. Um, we follow Isabel into these ancient ruins in Rome. If you've ever been to Rome, the ruins are everywhere, and everybody just takes it as a matter of course. Whereas if you're an American, you go there and there are ancient ruins. There are ruins that are 2,000 years old, and yet they remain. And that is the point that Isabel is seeing with her locale in Rome. Small it was in the large Roman record, and her haunting sense of the continuity of the human lot easily carried her from the less to the greater. So she's able to utilize the context of ancient Rome. That's why she has to be in Rome, because it can't get any more historic and ancient. There's a place at the middle of the page 540, 546, the Alban Mount, which was one of James's favorite places. That's in your notes. And there's another reference to Tennyson, the romantic poet. So she's walking around these ruins, and she gazed through the veil of her personal sadness at the splendid sadness of the scene. Splendid sadness, as if the sadness is somehow made more human by its largeness. Largeness. 547 at the top. She asked herself with an almost childlike horror of the supposition whether to this intimate friend of several years the great historical epithet of wicked were to be applied. This is a very famous line. Star it for sure. Um, she knew the idea only by the Bible and other literary works. To the best of her belief, she had no personal acquaintance with wickedness. And now she's beginning the veil of her friendship, so to speak, with Madame Merrill is beginning to lift. And behind it, she sees this kind of manipulation that she has experienced at the hand of Madame Merrill. A few lines later, perhaps it was not wicked in the historic sense to be false, perhaps for that was what Madame Merrill had been. Isabel's Aunt Lydia had made this discovery long before. Remember, Aunt Lydia, Mrs. Touchette, had said that Madame Merrill was not a good person. Ralph had said the same thing, and had mentioned it to her niece. But Isabel had flattered herself at this time that she had a much richer view of things, especially of the spontaneity of her own career and the nobleness of her own interpretations, though poor, stiffly reasoning Mrs. Touchette. Isabel, it's there's a kind of um, almost an arrogance in Isabel's former position as a better determiner of character. She's been told a couple of times that Madame Merrill is evil, or at least wicked, at least not what she appears to be. And in that, therein lies Isabel's mistake. A few lines later at the bottom, she had found her profit not in the gross device of borrowing money from Isabel, but in the more refined idea of introducing one of her intimates to the young girl's fortune. She had naturally chosen her closest intimate, and it was, turn the page, already vivid enough to Isabel that Gilbert Osmond occupied this position. So, piece by piece, Isabel's beginning to see the reality of the relationship between Madame Merrill and Osmond. She found herself confronted in this manner with the conviction that the man in the world whom she had supposed to be the least sordid had married her for her money. Well, duh, we knew that. But now Isabel sees it. A few lines later, in the middle of this paragraph, it was not slow to occur to her that if Madame Merrill had wished to do Osmond a service, his recognition of the fact must have lost its worth. So we haven't gotten to the real gist of this yet, but the terribleness of what Isabel has walked into is beginning to be revealed. If you're, let's see, we look at the bottom of the page, um, bottom page 549, sorry. You wish to condemn me to silence? Remember that I have never been a chatterbox. At any rate, there are 3 or 4 things I should like to say to you first. Your wife, whoops, whoops, your wife doesn't know what to do with herself, she went on with a change of tone. Excuse me, this is Madame Merrill and Osmond. Excuse me, she knows perfectly. She has a line sharply marked out. She means to carry out her ideas. And that is, in fact, a good assessment of Isabel. She has a line on which she is going to march. And we now that we've finished the novel, we think that maybe she'll take Henrietta's advice, but we think maybe not. Maybe she is on this path that she has marked for herself and is committed to it. At the bottom of page 550, it was precisely my devilry that stupefied her. I couldn't help it. I was full of something bad. Perhaps it was something good. I don't know. You have not only dried up my tears, you have dried up my soul. And yes, we think that's probably true. Madame Merrill doesn't seem to have much of a soul anymore. Top of page 551, Madame Merrill says you are very bad. And then is this the way we are to end? Osmond asked with the same studied coldness. I don't know how we are to end. I wish I did. How do bad people end? You have made me bad. Really, they've made each other bad. Or they started out bad and didn't get any better. Bottom of page 551. Oh, the imagination of women, exclaims Osmond. It's always vulgar at bottom. You talk of revenge like a third-rate novelist. Of course, you haven't complained. You have enjoyed your triumph too much. I am rather curious to know why you call what you call my triumph. You have made your wife afraid of you. Mm-hmm. Is that his triumph? Probably because he can manipulate Isabel in any way that he wants. And we see in many of their conversations the meanness of it. Over at the top of page 552, Isabel is not afraid of me, and it's not what I wish, he said at last. To what do you wish to provoke me when you say such things as that? And Madame Merrill says, I have thought over all the harm you can do me, Madame Merrill answered. Your wife was afraid of me this morning, but in me it was really you she feared. That's because they are similar personalities, and there is a connection between them that has yet to be revealed. You may have said things that were in very bad taste. That's all that Osmond cares about, is whether or not things appear tasteful. Go down to the bottom of page 552. I have seen better what you have been to your wife than I ever saw what you were for me. There's such innuendo here. And Madame Merrill says down at the bottom, I never adored you. Okay. Isabel did. She did adore Osmond, but it was this facade. She didn't really know him. Page 553. It is true that you never accused me of being a comfortable fit. My wife has declined to do anything of the sort. The tragedy is for me. What is going on here, you wonder? Madame Merrill exclaimed. End of the paragraph. It appears that I am to be severely taught the disadvantages of a false position. Mm-hmm. Hers is a false position. Middle of page 553. You are more like a copybook than I. There is something, after all, that holds us together. Is it the idea of the harm I may do you? Osmond says, no, it's the idea of the good I may do for you. It is that, said Madame Merrill. That made me so jealous. What? That made me so jealous of Isabel. I want it to be my work. Because of Madame Merrill's manipulation behind the scenes, she has now made it so that Isabel is in the position to alter things. That's what made Madame Merrill so jealous. And at the at the end of this page, after he had left her, Madame Merrill went and lifted from the mantel shelf the attenuated coffee cup in which he had mentioned the existence of a crack. She looked at it rather abstractly. Have I been so vile, all for nothing? The phrase, looking for the existence of a crack, there is a crack going on here. Maybe not in the coffee cup, in one of these little trinkets that he so values. And she asks herself, have I been really bad for nothing? Next chapter, 556. I gotta pick up the pace here a little bit, or I'm not gonna get to what I have. Look at, I've got all of these, all kinds of documents here. So we are going to visit the Countess Gemini. She's an unusually, she's just kind of a weird, she's an odd duck, let's say it. As the Countess Gemini was not acquainted with the ancient monuments, Isabel occasionally offered to introduce her to these interesting relics and to give her their afternoon drive an antiquarian aim. So she, with Isabel and the Countess, and sometimes even Pansy, they go off into these into the relics of ancient Rome. And it's here that Isabel is able to let down her facade a little bit, become part of history so that her own sadness isn't so sharp. Um, and she's here in these ancient ruins, page 555, and here comes Edward Roussier. He reappears. And he says that he has sold all of his bibelots. He had a whole collection of little trinkets, and he sold them all. And his point was for Pansy. He wants to marry Pansy, and um, they're kind of two peas in a pod, Pansy and Rosier, and it's because they're both kind of superficial and um not that sharp. But he loves her nonetheless, so much so that he would sell all of his little trinkets, and he made quite a fortune over it. He says, I have the money instead, $40,000. And as with many times, when I look up these equivalents, I get a whole different, many different options. But as far as I can tell, this is approximately $800,000, way more than what he had before. My dear friend, you deserve to succeed, said Isabel. Um, so I think she would advocate for Rosier, but Isabel is up against a very bitter wall in her husband. What does Mr. Osmond expect after she has refused Lord Warburton? Isabel hesitated a moment. That he will marry another nobleman, or that she will marry another nobleman. Remember, once Warburton was gone, so far as Osmond could tell, Warburton invited them to come to England, and the light bulb goes on for Osmond. Ooh, perhaps I can find another nobleman for Pansy. And you wonder about Osmond's intent. He's so committed to Pansy doing as he wants, to Pansy's choosing a husband based on what Osmond wants. There's something very weird about Pansy and her commitment to her father, and that weirdness is partly because of her upbringing. She was raised in a convent, and at least we're made to think that. If we look over on the top of 558, at the same time, a wave of envy passed over her soul as she compared the tremulous longing, the definite ideal of the young girl with her own dry despair. So Pansy and Isabel are compared here. Pansy is controlled but doesn't feel the kind of despair, or at least we don't think so. But we are led to believe occasionally that Pansy does love Rosier, and there's something really catastrophic about the fact that she can't marry whomever, and that he has now sold all of his little trinkets for her. That's a genuine love. And then Pansy says she's going back to the convent because Papa thinks it best on page 559. Her announcement had a strange effect upon Isabel. It seemed to carry a larger meaning than the girl herself knew. He's sending her back. And why is he sending her back? To get her away from Rosier. That's pretty clear. Um, We look at the top of page 560. Yeah, 560. Pansy's going back to the convent. It had become her habit to be so careful as to what she said to him that this is Isabel. That strange as it may appear, she hesitated for several minutes after he had come in to allude to his daughter's sudden departure. She spoke of it only after they were seated at the table, but she had forbidden herself ever to ask Osmond a question. Wow, that's a really bad place to be for Isabel. She had thought Osmond was such a great guy. Middle of the next paragraph. But I have always had the idea. I have always thought it a part of the education of a young girl. This is Osmond. A young girl should be fresh and fair. She should be innocent and gentle. With the manners of the present time, she is liable to become so dusty and crumpled. He doesn't want her contaminated by her any kind of relationship with Rossier. This bustling, pushing rabble that calls itself society, one should take her out of it occasionally. That's his reasoning for sending her back to the convent. Um, Down at the bottom of page 560, he contemplated a while the picture he had evoked and seemed greatly pleased with it. He's always posturing. At the top of 561, it's a school of good manners. It's a school of repose, and I don't want to detach my daughter from the world. But he does want to get her away from Rossier. Next paragraph. But she understood it better than he supposed or desired, inasmuch as she was convinced that the whole proceeding was an elaborate mystification, addressed to herself and destined to act upon her imagination. He wished to do something sudden and arbitrary. Remember that Isabel and Pansy have a very nice relationship. It's a loving relationship. And here is Osmond removing Pansy from Isabel. In part, the narrator tells us, to hurt Isabel, to mark the difference between his sympathies and her own, and to show her that if he regarded his daughter as a precious work of art, it was natural he should be more and more careful about the finishing touches. If he wished to be effective, he had succeeded. The incident struck a chill into Isabel's heart. She's a possession, and he can do what he wants with her, Pansy, and he can use her to wound Isabel. Poor little Pansy became the heroine of a tragedy. At the top of page 562. Why don't you say at once that you want to get her out of my way? Haven't you discovered that I think very well of Mr. Rossier? I do indeed. He seems to me to be a delightful young man. He has made me believe in true love. Oh, it's so sad. Um, Down at the bottom of this page, 562, my dear Amy, he answered, smiling as if he were uttering a piece of gallantry. I don't know anything about your convictions, but if I suspected that they interfere with mine, it would be much simpler to banish you. So, yikes. He's even willing to get rid of the Countess, his very own sister. He's not very nice to her. Next page, 563. She added that she had really two good patients on her hands instead of one, for that Mr. Goodwood, who had been of no earthly use, was quite as sick in a different way as Mr. Touchette. Um, so here's Goodwood again. Um, he uh, he apparently never even went back to America. So if we look on page 564, Isabel walks into Osmond's study, and there's always an admonition from him. He's always saying something nasty. Excuse me for disturbing you, she said. When I come to your room, I always knock. I mean, she can't do right. She says, I forgot. I had something else to think of. My cousin is dying. So Isabel gets the telegram from Mrs. Touchette saying that she needs to come quick because Ralph is dying. And he's been dying from the start, but now he's really dying. And top of page 565. Why should I mind that? You won't like it if I don't. You like nothing I do or don't do. You pretend to think I lie. Osmond turned slightly pale. He gave a cold smile. This conversation is so sharp and so almost aggressive, but Isabel is holding her own in the face of his meanness. He says, I do. Don't give me an occasion. You are only too eager to take one. You wish immensely that I would commit some folly. I shall be gratified then if you disobey me. So we can, this kind of gives us a picture of the context in which some women found themselves as being controlled by their husbands. They had no other way of existing. Remember, we've seen this over and over and over in stories from the period that that women were controlled by their husbands and they had no recourse. Isabel has some recourse, however, because she's got the money. You look on the next page. Oh, let's see who's saying this. Isabel says, you have no reason, this is at bottom 565. You have no reason for such a wish, and I have every reason for going. I can't tell you how unjust you seem to me, but I think you know. It is your own opposition that is calculated. It is malignant. And we think that's true. This is a very important matter, she says, next paragraph. She recognized this. She was fully conscious of the weight of the occasion. She knew that between them they had arrived at a crisis. Its gravity made her careful. She said nothing, and he went on. You say I have no reason? I have the very best. I dislike from the bottom of my soul what you intend to do. It is dishonorable. It is indelicate. It is indecent. It's not, we know, but he has made it by giving it those names. He is telling her that you will sabotage your wedding vows by going to see Ralph. And let's see, your relations with him while he was here kept me on pins and needles, but I let that pass because from week to week I expected him to go. I have never liked him, and he has never liked me. That's why you like him, because he hates me. It's such a lack of understanding of the relationship between Isabel and Ralph. She should not travel across Europe alone in defiance of my deepest desire to sit at the bedside of other men. Oh, he has really painted that into a dishonorable corner down at the bottom of this page, because I think we should accept the consequences of our actions. And what I value most in life is the honor of a thing. Well, that is a synopsis of his personality. That's the only thing he cares about. What he doesn't want is for her to be gallivanting across the continent like an American woman, alone, which is what she should not be doing as the wife of Osmond. At the top of 567, his last words were not a command. They constituted a kind of appeal, and though she felt that any expression of respect on Osmond's part could only be a refinement of egotism, they represented something transcendent and absolute. It's the observance of a magnificent form. That's what he is, magnificent form. A few lines later, it came over her that in his wish to preserve appearances, he was, after all, sincere, and that this, as far as it went, was a merit. So he's true to himself, I guess. Next page. Okay. 568. Pretty much in the smack middle of the paragraph. Osmond possessed in a supreme degree the art of eliciting one's weakness. That is what he's good at. And at the top of page 569, let's see, it begins on the preceding page. Half an hour before, Isabel would have listened very coldly to an intimation that she should ever feel a desire for the sympathy of her sister-in-law, and there was no better proof of her present embarrassment than the fact that she almost clutched at this lady's fluttering attention. She says, I have been with Osmond, she said, while the Countess's bright eyes glittered. There's something interesting about the Countess. Remember, early on when we have seen her, she appeared to be an advocate for Isabel. And Isabel's admitted that she has seen Osmond and essentially asked or stated that she was going to go and see Ralph. And the Countess says, I am sure he has been odious. I, I don't know how many times, but the Countess knows that her brother's a creep, and he's a bully, really. Did he say that he was glad poor Mr. Touchette is dying? He said it is impossible I should go to England. Well, it's not. She can take herself. Next paragraph. And then she cared enough for Isabel's trouble to forget her own, and she saw that Isabel's trouble was deep. It seemed deeper than the mere death of a cousin, and the Countess had no hesitation in connecting her exasperating brother with the expression of her sister-in-law's eyes. The Countess sees it. And we know that she's kind of a birdish person, but she has some insights, especially into her brother. At the top of 570, Isabel says, I am afraid. Yes, I am afraid. And we know that Osmond doesn't hit her, which what might be the supposition you get from that. But she says a few lines later, it was simply the violence there would be in going when Osmond wished her to remain. A gulf of difference had opened between them, but nevertheless it was his desire that she should stay. It was a horror to him that she should go. She knew the nervous fineness with which he could feel an objection. What he thought of her, she knew. What he was capable of saying to her, she had felt. Yet they were married, for all that, and the marriage meant that a woman should abide by her husband. And there, right there, in that paragraph, is the dilemma that Isabel faces. She married voluntarily based on what she thought Osmond was. He has now revealed himself to be something different, and yet she is still honoring her marriage vows. At the top of 571, there's something I want you to know, the Countess declared, because I think you ought to know it. Perhaps you can do. Perhaps you have guessed it. What? Yes, here's where it begins to unfold. But if you have, all I can say is that I understand still less why you shouldn't do as you like. Middle of this page, big fat star. My first sister-in-law had no children. And I'd forgotten how this unfolded, but it was just so clever. It was after her death that Pansy made her appearance. So the Osmond's first wife had no children. She died. And then Pansy made an appearance after the first wife died. Pansy is not my husband's child, then, she says. Your husband's imperfection, but no one else's husband. Someone else's wife. Ah, my good Isabel, cried the Countess. With you, one must dot one's I's. She has to come out and say it. I don't understand whose wife, said Isabel. The wife of a horrid little Swiss who died 12 years ago. He never recognized Miss Pansy, and there was no reason he should. Osmond did, and that was better. Mid-page. So I believed, though it was hard to believe, has it never occurred to you that he has been her lover? I don't know. Something has occurred to me, she says. Perhaps it was that. She has been wonderfully clever about Pansy, cried the Countess. Few lines down, last complete paragraph. Don't you perceive that the child could never pass for her husband's? The Countess asked. Madame Merrill's husband's. They had been separated too long for that, and Madame Merrill had gone to some far country. So this child could not have been Madame Merrill's husband, which I am not aware of. She had lost them. Oh, wait, if she had ever had children, which I am not sure of, she had lost them. On the other hand, circumstances made it convenient enough for Osmond to acknowledge the little girl. His wife was dead, very true, but she had only been dead a year, and what was more natural than that she should have left behind a pledge of her affection? Now we're getting an idea of why Pansy was committed to the convent for so long. Because that was how Osmond could explain her existence. 573. To you he has been faithful. It depends on what you call faithful. When he married you, he was no longer the lover of another woman. When he married you, he was no longer Madame Merrill's lover. But the whole past was between them. And that is what Isabel saw in the easy relationship, that moment when she walked in on them. But for 5 years, they were very intimate. Why then did she want him to marry me? Ah, my dear, that's her superiority, because you had money, and because she thought you would be good to Pansy. That's the reason she wanted someone whom Pansy would like. She knows it. She knows everything. At the bottom of this page. That will depend upon whether you tell her. She is prepared for it, and do you know what she counts on for defense? On your thinking that I lie. Remember, we've been told repeatedly that Countess fibs. So, do we believe the Countess? Yes, because it's Osmond who says she fibs. And she does, but not in the big things. Perhaps you do. Don't make yourself uncomfortable to hide it. Only as it happens this time, I don't. I have told little fibs, but they have never hurt anyone but myself. And therein lies the truth of the Countess. On the next page, first complete paragraph. Because she had no money. Why did Osmond never marry her? Because she had no money. The Countess had an answer for everything, and if she lied well. No one knows, no one has ever known, what she lives on, or how she got all those beautiful things. We don't know. Remember that Madame Merrill flits from one household to another, pretty much living with people without payment. So she's living without having any expenses. We noticed that early on in the novel when she appeared. Her relations with Osmond had changed, and she had grown more ambitious. She hoped she might marry a great man. So, like Osmond wants Pansy, Osmond and Madame Merrill, they want Pansy to marry Lord Warburton because it would be a good match, because it would be an aristocratic match. And then Pansy would become Lady Warburton. In the same way that Madame Merrill wanted a good match for herself. So her life, as we learn, has not been a success. She was afraid of me for years, and she has taken great comfort in the vile, false things that people have said about me. She has been afraid I would expose her, and she threatened me one day. So here we have this bird-like creature who's kind of odd, but she holds the nugget of Madame Merrill and Osmond. She holds that truth. Top of page 575. Well, and that's why Osmond doesn't like his sister around, because she's a threat. Her great idea has been to be tremendously irreproachable, a kind of full-blown lily, the incarnation of propriety. That sounds just exactly like Osmond. The two of them are committed to propriety. There appeared in next paragraph. There appeared to have been a chance of Pansy's making a great marriage, and in her disappointment at its not coming off, she almost dropped the mask. Do you remember when this was a number of chapters ago, when Madame Merrill discovers that Pansy isn't going to marry Warburton? She snaps her head around and almost lets down her guard, and Isabel sees it. She still doesn't know what she's looking at. And here is the Countess revealing the truth. At the bottom of 575, that you might take such a fancy to the child that you would do something for her. They were banking on it, that Isabel would give her a dowry and make her desirable. And we think that's well within Isabel's capability, because Isabel loves Pansy. For, she says at the top, the Countess says, and this is the question. Ah, my dear, cried the Countess, why did you ever inherit money? The cause effect is clear. The initial cause is the money, is half of Ralph's money. And it made Isabel a completely different creature in the greater scheme of things. Next few paragraphs. Well, I should say, as a woman who has been made use of, Isabel says. Isabel made no answer to this. She only listened, and the Countess went on. They have always been bound to each other. They remained so even after she became proper. But he has always been more for her than she has been for him. Curious. At the end of this paragraph, she is an old habit. There are moments when he needs her, but on the whole, he wouldn't miss her if she were removed. And what's more, today she knows it, so you needn't be jealous. But you can imagine what that felt like, to make this discovery of Madame Merrill's real position, and that they have played her like the marionette. And Isabel just walked right on into it. And so the Countess asks at the top of 577, now will you give up your journey? So, in light of what you know now, thanks to the Countess, essentially, it gives Isabel permission from her own commitment to her marriage vows. It gives her permission to go. She says, I must see Ralph. Isabel murmured, not in resentment, not in the quick passion of her compassion had looked for, but in a tone of exquisite, far-reaching sadness. So I read somewhere, I think I told you this, that the relationship between Isabel and Ralph is one of those that's never comes to fruition. And so we see that she does go to she goes to England to be with Ralph, but at first, the first thing she does is goes to see Pansy. She disliked the place, the convent, and it made her horribly sad. Not for the world would she have spent a night there. It produced today more than before the impression of a well-appointed prison. For it is not possible to pretend that Pansy was free to leave it. This innocent creature had been presented to her in a new and violent light. Violent light. So now Pansy is also a tool, I guess. But the secondary effect of the revelation was to make Isabel reach out her hand to her. So I, of course, really liked that image of the convent being like a prison, a well-appointed prison, since I work in a well-appointed prison. And so I get the tone that that Isabel is perceiving in this environment. Um, so at the bottom of this, there's an interesting contrast. Bottom of page 578. On the other occasion, Isabel had thought it less like Rome than like Philadelphia. So here's the contrast between the old of Europe and the new in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is without the history, without the all of the broken down bits of history that Isabel felt in Rome. Philadelphia is kind of bald, and today she made no reflections. The apartment only seemed to her very empty and very soundless. The portress returned at the end of some 5 minutes, ushering in another person, and this other person is Madame Merrill. And we wonder, what is she doing there? Isabel had been thinking all day of her falsity, her audacity, her ability, her probable suffering. So that's curious, isn't it? That Isabel could identify with Madame Merrill's potential suffering at having to give up Osmond, or not. Madame Merrill's pretty cold. Um, she was more than ever playing a part, Madame Merrill. And on the following page, but Isabel, far afloat on a sea of wonder and pain, could not have told herself with what intention it was uttered. But I have not been sitting long, Madame Merrill continued. That is, I have not been long with Pansy. I came to see her because it occurred to me this afternoon that she must be rather lonely and perhaps even a little miserable. So I'm not sure we believe that, because Madame Merrill is always plotting something. We look at the bottom of page 580. So Madame Merrill went on with much of the brilliancy of a woman who had long been a mistress of the art of conversation. Page, and I'm sure that James picked the word mistress pointedly because Madame Merrill was the mistress. Top of 581. This subtle modulation marked a momentous discovery, the perception of an entirely new attitude on the part of her listener. Madame Merrill had guessed in the space of an instant that everything was at an end between them, and in the space of another instant she guessed the reason why. Isabel knows. The Countess blabbed. Number of lines later, her only safety was in not betraying herself. She did not betray herself, but the startled quality of her voice refused to improve. She couldn't help it. While she herself while she heard herself say she hardly knew what, the tide of her confidence ebbed, and she was able only just to glide into port, faintly grazing the bottom. The truth is revealed, and the facade comes down, the mask falls away in an instant. At the bottom of 581, she saw in the crude light of that revelation, which had already become a part of experience, and to which the very frailty of the vessel in which it had offered her only gave an intrinsic price, the dry, staring fact that she had been a dull, unreverenced tool. Mm-hmm. All the bitterness of this knowledge surged into her soul again. It was as if she felt on her lips the taste of dishonor. There was a moment during which, if she had turned and spoken, she would have said something that would hiss like a lash. A few lines later, Isabel's only revenge was to be silent still, to leave Madame Merrill in this unprecedented situation. It was the only response. It was a good response. She left her there for a period which must have seemed long to this lady, who at last seated herself with a movement which was in itself a confession of helplessness. So They know what each other knows. Isabel would never accuse her, never reproach her, perhaps because she never would give her the opportunity to defend herself. It's a really, it's probably the only response she could have had and still walk away with her dignity. Over on 583, all these departments were solid and bare, light and clean. So thought Isabel of the great penal establishments. Um, as a second reference to this being a jail. At the top of page 584, there was, let's see, what is this? This is Madame Catherine. She's the I was going to say the chief nun. She's the head of this convent. We think of you always. You are a precious charge, Madam Catherine remarked in the tone of a woman with whom benevolence was a habit. Sure, again, a habit, like the habit of a nun, and whose conception of duty was the acceptance of every care. It fell with a leaden weight upon Isabel's ears. It seemed to represent the surrender of a personality, the authority of the church, in much the way Pansy surrendered to her father and to Madame Merrill. That is her demeanor. It's to surrender. We know that Pansy thinks some, and she observes things that people don't give her credit for. Pansy says on page 585, "Don't leave me here." Pansy says, "He thinks I have not had enough of this convent upbringing. All this was very delightful, but I have had enough. Papa wished me to think a little, and I have thought a great deal." She says, "What have you thought?" "Well, that I must never displease Papa." "Yes, but I know it better. I will do anything. I will do anything," she says. And then Isabel read the meaning of it. She saw that the poor girl had been vanquished. Oh, yep, she gave in. She can't help it. That's the, every fiber of the education she has received was based on her relinquishing to her father. At the end of this paragraph, she bowed her pretty head to authority and only asked of authority to be merciful. Um, Down at the bottom of this. Um, Now, when you are so far, I'm a little afraid. What are you afraid of? Isabel asks her. Of Papa, a little, and of Madame Merrill. A few lines later. Oh, I will do everything they want. Only if you are here, I shall do it more easily. Isabel reflected a little. I won't desert you. This is key. This is key to understanding the end of the novel. She says she will not desert Pansy. Um, and then Pansy says at the top of the page, 587, I don't like Madame Merrill. Well, and we have to give credit where credit is deserved, because while the poor thing has given in to Madame Merrill and to her father, she makes observations that the others don't give her credit for. Um, Isabel says you can't say that about her. At the top, let's see, where are we? Then Isabel leaves Pansy and goes downstairs, or goes to that place where they were sitting before the parlor. And there's Madame Merrill again. And down at the bottom of page 588, Isabel stood staring. She seemed today to be living in a world illumined by lurid flashes. I don't know why you say such things. I don't know what you know. I know nothing but what I have guessed, but I have guessed that. Isabel went to the door, and when she had opened it, stood a moment with her hand on the latch, and then she said it was her only revenge. I believed it was you I had to thank. So they'd been talking about Ralph having willed her, or finessed her the funds, but really, that's not what Isabel's talking about. And Then she said it was her only revenge. I believed it was you I had to thank. Telling Madame Merrill that in fact she knows the entire cause effect. Madame Merrill orchestrated Isabel's marriage to Osmond. And here's how she lets Madame Merrill know. Madame Merrill dropped her. Oh, so many R's. Madame Merrill dropped her eyes. She stood there in a kind of proud penance. You are very unhappy, I know, but I am more so. So the proud penance is an unusual. It seems like an oxymoron, doesn't it? A proud penance. Luckily, I have an article, and it says The Proud Penitent, Madame Merrill's Quiet Triumph in Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady. She did triumph. She got what she wanted. So this is by William Sayers, and it was published in Essays in Literature by Western Illinois University. Okay. And this proud penitent, she won. Okay. What then might be Merrill's so-called motives in bringing together Isabel and Osmond? Avarice on her own. Osmond's or Pansy's behalf does not explain her persistent selling, quote unquote, selling of Osmond, one of the most delightful men I know. That's what Merrill had told Isabel early on, during her early acquaintance with Isabel. Bewitched by Merrill and a credulous consumer of her cleverly packaged product, Isabel does not entertain a suspicion of its contents. Yet all this marketing occurs before Merrill learns of Isabel's legacy from Daniel Touchette. Although the Countess Gemini later confides to Isabel her shrewd guesswork that Merrill hoped Isabel might take such a fancy to Pansy that you do something for her. We just saw that. Merrill primarily utilizes her acquired knowledge of the fortune as an inducement for Osmond to court Isabel, since he seems disinclined to make the effort otherwise. Yep, it was the money. There's no indication that Osmond will pay a finder's fee, quote unquote, to Merrill for brokering this relationship, and the razor sharp edges of their conversations with each other cut out any conjecture that some kind of residual love and affection will induce a sharing of this windfall. They're not. Osmond's not going to share anything with Madame Merrill. He probably could. Um, Thus, it is crucial for Osmond's cash flow that the marriage with Isabel be kept intact, because if she walks away, so does the money. Wow. I don't know what that one is there. The Countess. Wait. Why then did she want him to marry me? Isabel asks. The Countess reverses Merrill's motives with the explanation, because you had money and because she believed you would be good to Pansy. There it is. If Merrill does not consider money as the primary usefulness of Isabel, then we must look at other measures of value in the relationship of Pansy and her stepmother. And that relationship is corrupt, because Pansy doesn't like Madame Merrill. And Madame Merrill is her mother, for gosh sakes. But Pansy sees through the facade that Madame Merrill has created to make herself acceptable, to make herself not acceptable, but to make herself viable. In a world where she doesn't have any money, she has a bad husband who doesn't pay any attention to her and doesn't care about her. Okay, so let's get back to this. I believed it was you I had to thank. And she acknowledges that she is very unhappy, but Madame Merrill's more unhappy. Not that we feel sorry for her at all. Next chapter. Let's see, are we getting on? Yes. Down at the bottom of page 5. 90. Now that she was in the secret, now that she knew something that so much concerned her, and the eclipse of which made life resemble an attempt to play whist with an imperfect pack of cards, the truth of things, their mutual relations, their meaning, and for the most part their horror, rose before her like a kind of architectural vastness. She remembered a thousand trifles. They started to life with the spontaneity of a shiver. That is, she had thought them trifles at the time. Now she saw that they were leaden weighted. Yet even now they were trifles, after all, for of what use were they to her now to understand? So, having made the discovery, or having been told the issue from the Countess, Isabel can go back and see all of the trifles that were evidence that she never saw. Um, she envied Ralph his dying. For if one were thinking of rest, and that was the most perfect of all, to cease utterly, to give it all up, and not know anything more. So that's kind of pathetic. Um, and yet she lets go of that. There was nothing to regret now. That was all over. I'm on mid page 591. Not only the time of her folly, but the time of her repentance seemed far away. The only thing to regret was that Madame Merrill had been so strange. Down at the bottom of this page, deep in her soul, deeper than any appetite for renunciation, was the sense that life would be her business for a long time to come. And at moments there was something inspiring, almost exhilarating in the conviction. It was a proof of strength. It was a proof that she should someday be happy again. So she's sunk into despair, and yet she's beginning to pull herself out because she sees that her life is long. And you have to go back to James's um, belief that his cousin, his real life cousin, who died at age 22, had all these possibilities that were not fulfilled. And Isabel can fulfill them. At the top of page 592, it couldn't be that she was to live only to suffer. She was still young, after all, and a great many things might happen to her yet. To live only to suffer, only to feel the injury of repeated and enlarged, it seemed to her that she was too valuable, too capable for that. And that's true. She knows that she is valuable. And the narrator tells us that she's not, this isn't a kind of arrogance. At the end of this chapter, page, paragraph, sorry, she should not escape. She should last. Then the middle years wrapped her about again, and the gray curtain of her indifference closed her in. But she hasn't given up. And then on the horizon comes um, Henrietta and her boyfriend. That's what he appears to be, Mr. Bantling. And Mr. Bantling admires Henrietta. It's a nice relationship. Whereas the one that Isabel has forsaken, or apparently has, the tragedy of the decision that Isabel made is something she has forsaken. But then we get the comparison to Henrietta and Mr. Bantling, and he really admires her. If we go to the top of page 594, um, they were at Bantling and Henrietta were at Garden Court. Isabel asks him, "Have you seen Ralph?" Only for a little, but he had been seeing people. Warburton was there the day before. Touchette was just the same as usual, except that he was in bed and that he looked tremendously ill and that he can't speak. Oh no. So if we go over to the top of page 596, you must remember, after all, that he won't make a scene, said Henrietta, of of Osmond. He won't make a scene. He will, though, Isabel answered gravely. It will not be the scene of a moment. It will be a scene that will last always. Isabel knows that Osmond will perpetuate the discord between them. Top of 596, a few lines later. Isabel Archer, I beg your pardon. You don't know why? Because I criticized you, and yet I have gone further than you. Mr. Osmond, at least, was born on the other side. Um, and then, so Henrietta is arguing with Isabel. Don't you see? Essentially, is what she's saying. Yes, you have. You have seen it. Um, then at the bottom of this page 596 is Henrietta reveals that she's going to marry Mr. Bantling, and I'm going to reside in London. Well, that seems like a change in course. One can't explain one's marriage, Isabel answered, and yours doesn't need to be explained. Mr. Bantling is very good. Down at the bottom of this page, on the other hand, he doesn't exaggerate its claims. I sometimes think we do in the United States. And she says at the top, this is Henrietta, I only say that we are too intellectual. We, meaning Americans, after all, is a glorious fault, but I am changed. A woman has to change a good deal to marry. Henrietta did not understand that at first, and it took her relationship with Mr. Bantling and its unfolding for her to understand what Isabel has faced. Next paragraph. It was rather a disappointment to find that she had personal susceptibilities, that she was subject to common passions, and that her intimacy with Mr. Bantling had not been completely original. There was a want of originality in her marrying him. There was even a kind of stupidity. And for a moment, to Isabel's sense, the dreariness of the world took on a deeper tinge. She's faulting Henrietta for conceding. She had seen Henrietta as an intellectual superior. She was a lady reporter. She had been, apparently has seen some fame for her writing, and yet, and that's what this narrator is telling her. We could have seen this one 20 chapters ago. It does lack originality, and but Henrietta is conforming to what is expected at the time. She thinks down at the bottom of 597, she thinks, oh, wait a minute, Lady Pencil. Henrietta went to see Bantling's sister. Do you remember her? She's kind of a free spirit. She's supposed to be very talented. She thinks she knows everything, but she doesn't understand a lady correspondent. So good. We're thinking to ourselves, good. Henrietta isn't going to forego that. That's part of her definition, her self definition. She thinks it's immoral that I should marry her brother. But after all, that isn't immoral enough, and she will never understand. Never. We look at the top of the next page. Oh, no, he hasn't, cried Miss Stackpole with a decision. I really believe that's what he wants to marry me for, just to find out. It's a fixed idea, a kind of fascination, kind of defining their relationship. Oh, well, said Henrietta, I have something to find out too. And Isabel saw that she had not renounced an allegiance, but planned an attack. She was at last about to grapple in earnest with England. So Henrietta does seem to achieve what she wanted. It's a good relationship. Next paragraph, he had found it out at least the great point that Miss Stackpole would not be wanting in initiative. It was evident that in the selection of a wife, he had been on his guard against this deficiency. So there aren't very many good relationships in this text. there seems to be. There's a mutual give and take and a mutual respect. So next chapter begins with arrival at Garden Court on the second occasion was even quieter than it had been on the first. That's an important point because she has now come full circle and she has returned to Garden Court. This is a place where she had felt peace and where she had begun her journey, and she has come back. The day was dark and cold. The dusk was thick in the corners of the wide brown rooms. Nothing was changed. She reflected that things change but little, while people change so much, and she became aware that she was walking about as her aunt had done on the day they had come to see her in Albany. It suddenly struck her that if her Aunt Lydia had not come that day, in just the way she had found her alone, everything might have been different. Mhm, mhm. She goes on. Um, but she was not looking at the picture. She was wondering. This Bonington, which is a romantic um, landscape. She wondered. She was wondering whether, if her aunt had not come that day in Albany, she would have married Caspar Goodwood. We think probably, don't we? She probably would have, and hers then would have been the conventional path. But because of the cause effects that occurred, the possibilities were then revealed. She wore a little gray dress. Um, oh, this is Mrs. Touchette. She had wondered the first time whether her remarkable kinswoman resembled more a queen regent or the matron of a jail. It's the third reference we've seen today of people being imprisoned. Um, let's see. The nurse had gone to her lunch, and I had stayed with him. He was the doctor who is supposed to look after him, but the man is good for nothing. He is always looking out of the window. We know that Ralph is dying, and the doctor's looking out the window. What, like many people in this period, if you're looking out the window, you're looking for something. What's he looking for? We're not sure, but we know that Ralph is going to leave the scene. Look at the top of page 601. Is there really no hope? Isabel asked. None whatever. There never has been. It has not been a successful life. No, it has only been a beautiful one. So Isabel while it was not a successful life because he didn't do much, but he was a kind, generous friend to her. Here and after a little, Isabel saw that her aunt was not so dry as she appeared, and her old pity for the poor woman's inexpressiveness, her want of regret and of disappointment came back to her. A few lines later, on the other hand, perhaps she was afraid. If she began to regret, it might take her too far. And she's speaking of Mrs. Touchette. Mrs. Touchette, remember, has a husband who had a husband who she was not connected to very much. Remember, Mrs. Touchette and Mr. Touchette had an unusual marriage. If we look over on page 603, at the top of page 603, her imagination had traversed half Europe. It halted, panting and even trembling a little, in the city of Rome. She figured herself announcing to her husband that Lord Warburton was to lead a bride to the altar, and she was, of course, not aware how extremely sad she looked while she made this intellectual effort. So, in the next paragraph, he was dead for poor Pansy. There's no hope of Pansy marrying Warburton. A few paragraphs later, um, Mrs. Touchette asks three questions of Isabel. First is, have you ever been sorry you didn't marry Lord Warburton? Isabel shook her head slowly. No, dear aunt. because she didn't love him. And then the next question, it is my husband that doesn't get on with me, said Isabel. So what's the problem with the marriage? My husband hates me, essentially. It's really quite sad. And then, do you still like Serena Merrill? And she says, not as I once did. And then Isabel reveals that Madame Merrill is going to America. She must have done something very bad. Yes, very bad, says Isabel. And it isn't that she had a child out of wedlock, which, of course, would have been a social disaster, but she made a convenience of me. She manipulated me, and I believed it, says Isabel. At the bottom, there was a strange tranquility in his face. It was as still as the lid of a box. Isn't that an interesting metaphor? So, Isabel has gone in to see Ralph. At the top of page 65. Now, mind you, I was reading this in my jail classroom, and I had picked it up during lunch. And then, as Ralph dies, I started to cry. And then my students came in, and they couldn't, they didn't know what to make of me. There I was crying about Ralph. Then he closed his eyes again, as if he too were waiting for something that certainly would come. A few lines later, she had a constant fear. She thought it possible that her husband would write to her. Yikes. But worse, he doesn't. Top of 606. I was not waiting for your death. I was waiting for this. This is not death, dear Ralph. There is nothing makes me feel so much alive as to see others die. It's a weird observation from a man who's dying, but maybe there is some truth to it, that we as human beings gain something by comparison to someone who dies. Um, I better live my life because that's going to happen to me. Um, she says to him, I wish it were over for you. Here's where I started to cry. I don't want to cry again. I, she says, or he says, you won't lose me. You will keep me. Keep me in your heart. I shall be nearer to you than I have ever been. Dear Isabel, life is better, for in life there is love. Death is good, but there is no love. And she says, I never thanked you. I never spoke. I never was what I should be. So remember, this phrase has been um, hammered out to us many times. I never was what I should be. In some ways, the possibilities, she's hampered them for herself. All her troubles for the moment became single and melted together into this present pain of watching him leave her. What must you have thought of me? You Yet how could I know? I never knew, and I only know today because there are people less stupid than I am. Ralph, meaning. Um, yeah, at the top of 607. Don't speak of that. That was not happy. And then, but for that, but for that. And he paused. I believe I ruined you, he said. Retrospectively, we wonder about that gift of money. He thought he was freeing her. Next paragraph, but even if she had not had it, she would still have spoken, for nothing mattered now but only the knowledge that was not pure anguish, the knowledge that they were looking at the truth together. And she said, he married me for my money. And Ralph knew that. But she made the decision anyway. He was greatly in love with you, he answered. Yes, he was in love with me, but he would not have married me if I had been poor. I don't hurt you in saying that. How can I? I only want you to understand. I always tried to keep you from understanding, but that's all over. She tried to hide that from him. Remember, she tried. Remember, he said, she appears to be greatly happy, or something similar to that. Appears. She was putting on a cloak. You don't hurt me. You make me happy. I always understood, he continued, though it was so strange, so pitiful. You wanted to look at life for yourself, but you were not allowed. You were punished for your wish. You were ground in the very mill of the conventional. Okay, so that is the fault that she finds in Henrietta's marriage to Bantling, that it was conventional. And yet, Henrietta is able to declare her independence, whereas Isabel, she can't get rid of the oppression of Osmond. Top of the next page. It is all over then between you. Oh no, I don't think anything is over. Are you going back to him? Ralph stammered. I don't know. I can't tell, she says. Here on my knees with you dying in my arms, I'm happier than I have been for a long time, and I want you to be happy, not to think of anything sad, only to feel that I am near you and love you. So he says, I really liked Ralph, but he's dying. And he tells her, you will grow young again. She needs that little morsel of hope. And at the bottom, I don't believe that such a generous mistake as yours can hurt you for more than a little. Oh, Ralph, I am very happy now. And he says, and remember this, that if you have been hated, you have also been loved. Ah, my brother, she cried, with a movement of still deeper prostration. Next chapter. Oh, my goodness. Remember how this chapter begins. With a reference to the ghost that Ralph referenced. And he had told her the first evening she ever spent at Garden Court that if she should live to suffer enough, she might some day see the ghost with which the old house was duly provided. And she wakes up, or maybe she actually never even fell asleep, there in an instant that Ralph was standing there, a dim hovering figure in the dimness of the room. She stared a moment, she saw his white face. And so it may be that the ghost that haunts Garden Court is something that she will experience because she has suffered. And the ghost in this case is Ralph, but in there may be other figures in this, but for her it's Ralph. Um, and Mrs. Touchette, who's not the warmest woman, um, Isabel understands that Ralph has probably died. And Mrs. Touchette says on the next page, go and thank God you have no child. But the reality is that she did have a child. The child died when the child was six months old. So she did suffer. If it was sad to think of poor Touchette, it was not too sad, since death for him had had no violence. He had been dying so long, he was so ready, everything had been so expected and prepared. So Ralph's friends come to the funeral, and it's Lord Warburton, Miss Stackpole, and here comes Caspar again. He appears, and we're given to know that Caspar did not go back to the United States. He was there, however, very distinctly there, and something in his attitude seemed to say that he was there with a complex intention. What do we think? Next paragraph. He was not one of the best husbands, but that didn't alter the case. Who's not one of the best husbands? Oh, Mrs. Touchette. Okay. Certain obligations were involved in the very fact of marriage and were quite independent of the quantity of enjoyment extracted from it. Isn't that telling? One's marriage is a complex thing, and it's not related. It's really almost funny, certainly ironic. It is quite independent of the quantity of enjoyment extracted from it. Um, so on the next page, 614, she was quite unable to read, um, but her eyes often wandered from the book in her hand to the open window. She frequently has a book in her hand and never seems to read it, but she's now looking out the window. And we know that she will be looking for something, and that her life is not going to come to a grinding halt, because she will continue to move forward. Look on the next page, 615. When Lord Warburton lifted his own eyes, however, that was not what they said. They only said, "This is rather awkward, you know, and I depend upon you to help me." He looked extremely self-conscious. So Warburton, we know, seems to have committed to someone else, to marriage, and the two of them are pretty awkward together. Um, and then over on page 617, "Are you very sure he is to be married?" Isabel asks of her aunt. "I can't be surer than he, but he seems sure. I congratulated him, and he accepted it." "Ah," said Isabel, "I give it up." So she's closing that door. We know that she didn't love Warburton. She just didn't. But this door has closed. Next few lines, then she remembered that she had been sitting there 6 years before, when a servant brought her from the house the letter in which Caspar Goodwood informed her that he had followed her to Europe, and that when he had read the letter, she looked up to hear Lord Warburton announcing that he should like to marry her. Again, she's come back to Gardencourt, but now she's also come back to the bench where it all started. Um, if we look over at the end of page, or at the top of page 619, she was sharing it with Caspar Goodwood, who stood looking at her a few feet off, and whose footfall on the unresonant turf as he came near she had not heard. It occurred to her, in the midst of this, that it was just so Lord Warburton had surprised her of old, full circle, and he proposes something. Um, he says on page 619, let's see, "But I am not wrong now. Please don't think I am," he went on, with his hard, deep voice melting a moment into entreaty. "I came here today for a purpose. It's very different. It was no use for me to speak to you then, but now I can help you. I can help you." She listened to him as she had never listened before. His words dropped down into her soul. They produced a sort of stillness in all her being, and it was with an effort, in a moment, that she answered him. "How can you help me?" I think maybe she's willing to listen at least. "He was a member of your family, and he left you. So long as you should be in England, he left you to my care." And he tells her that Ralph said to her, "Do everything you can for her. Do everything she will let you." Therein lies the rub. That had been aimless, fruitless passion, but at present he had an idea. Elizabeth sent him the idea. Um, "If Touchette had never opened his mouth, I should have known all the same. I had only to look at you at your cousin's funeral to see what's the matter with you. You can't deceive me any more. For God's sake, be honest with a man who is so honest with you. You are the most unhappy of women, and your husband's a devil." Yes. Next paragraph. "How can you pretend you are not heartbroken? You don't know what to do. You don't know where to turn. It's too late to play a part. Didn't you leave all that behind you in Rome? Touchette knew all about it. And I knew, too, what it would cost you to come here. It will cost you your life. When I know that, how can I keep myself from wishing to save you? What would you think of me if I should stand still and see you go back to your reward? It's awful. What shall have to pay for it?" That's what Touchette had said. End of this paragraph. "I understand all about it. You are afraid to go back. You are you are perfectly alone. You don't know where to turn. Now it is that. Now it is that I want you to think of me." And He says, "You don't know where to turn. Turn to me. I want to persuade you to trust me. Why should you go back? Why should you go through that ghastly form? Why, indeed, should she go back?" And we know, because she told Pansy that she would come back. "To get away from you," she answers, kind of flippant. But this expressed only a little of what she felt. The rest was that she had never been loved before, and now she feels it. She knew that Ralph loved her. She said, and "I am yours forever, forever and ever." And a few lines later, "It would be an insult to you to assume that you care for the look of the thing, for what people will say, for the bottomless idiocy of the world." Well, we know that's exactly what Madame Merrill and Osmond think. What would it look like, you know? "I swear as I stand here that a woman deliberately made to suffer is justified in anything in life, in going down into the street, if that will help her. I know how you suffer, and that's why I'm here. We can do absolutely as we please. To whom under the sun do we owe anything? What is it that holds us? What is it that has the smallest right to interfere in such a question?" What is he asking her? There's a reference at the end of this paragraph to the fortunate fall. So is he asking her to be his mistress? Maybe. You look at the top of the next page. She wanted help, and here was help. But she believed that to let him take her in his arms would be the next best thing to dying. This belief for a moment was a kind of rapture in which she felt herself sinking and sinking. He's, he says to her, "Be mine as I am yours." And she said, "Do me the greatest kindness of all. I beseech you to go away." "Why?" "As you love me, as you pity me, leave me alone." And at the end of the next paragraph, she had not known where to turn, but she knew now there was a very straight path. Remember? Even Osmond knew that she had a straight path. And she's going to go. "Pray, what led you to suppose she was here?" Um, he goes to try and find her after they part and goes to Henrietta. Miss Stackpole says, "She came here yesterday and spent the night, but this morning she started for Rome. She's going to go back." "Oh," she started, he stammered, and without finishing his phrase or looking up, he turned away. Henrietta had come out, closing the door behind her, and now she put her hand and grasped his arm. "Look here, Mr. Goodwood, just you wait." On which he looked up at her. The novel ends with this unknown, which is why I think this other novelist writes, wait, this book, Mrs. Osmond. This is next. I'm going to read that one next. Um, but we believe at least there's some hope. Maybe not in for Goodwood, but there certainly seems to be hope for Isabel. We know that she has gone back to Rome, and in part it's to fulfill the promise that she made to Pansy. I want to point out a few quick things before we close. Nothing with this novel is quick, but if you look at the appendix that begins on page 424, this was the one that Henry James wrote preceding this version of the novel. There's a couple of important points, though most of this is a really complete um, synopsis of what happens. But a couple of things I want to point out. The weakness of the whole story is that it is too exclusively psychological, that it depends too little on incident, but the complete unfolding of the situation that is established by Isabel's marriage may nonetheless be quite sufficiently dramatic. That was his answer to the critics who said nothing ever happens in this book. The idea of the whole thing is that the poor girl who has dreamed of freedom and nobleness, who has done as she believes a generous, natural, clear-sighted thing, finds herself in reality ground in the very mill of conventional. After a year or two of marriage, the antagonism between her nature and Osmond's comes out, the open opposition of a noble character and a narrow one. And then at the top of page 525, the art required for making this delusion natural, and finds herself face to face with a husband who has ended by conceiving a hatred for her own larger qualities. Everything subsequent to that is a nice synopsis. It's quite good. Well, of course it is. Henry James wrote it, but I thought that was an important point. If we Okay. In the end, the concerns of society trump those of the individual. Isabel does not follow Henrietta's advice and turn to America's liberal divorce courts to dissolve her unhappy union with Osmond. In the final pages of Portrait, Isabel does not take back the vows she had solemnly bestowed, and we sense that she never will. By 1911, James appears to have struck a different balance between the opposing claims of the individual and society. That year, he would advise his friend Edith Wharton, I just thought this was so interesting, to obtain a divorce from her mentally unstable and unpredictable husband. Remember, that was Teddy. It's kind of like my Teddy, only he's not unstable. In 1881, however, so in 1911, when he writes another preface, he seems to have found a different answer to the oppositions between the individual and society. But in 1881, however, James could not bring himself to endorse divorce as a solution for his unhappy heroine, could not imagine a separate existence for Isabel. So it does end with a question. What have you to care about? You have no children. That perhaps would be an obstacle. Um, this is Goodwin says, at the end, what have you to go back to? You must save what you can of your life. You mustn't lose it all simply because you've lost a part. It should be an insult to you to assume that you care for the look of the thing. We just read that part. It is not clear whether Caspar wants Isabel to obtain a divorce or wants her simply to engage in an illicit relationship with him, but his proposal threatens her marriage either way, so she has to send him away because she has committed herself to her marriage vows. Although it seems fairly clear that Isabel will return to Osmond, she darts out of the portrait's frame at the end before we can be certain of the final steps she will take. She leaves us forever in the moment of running away, poised on the brink of a decision. The novel remains poised between alternatives in much the same way that Isabel does. Acknowledging the power of Henrietta's subversive suggestion to Isabel, even as it attempts to prevent the journalist from articulating her argument, the novel makes visible contradictory strains in American culture, as well as tensions in James's own ideas about marriage. In Portrait, James resists the idea of dissolving the conjugal tie at the same time he continually reaches toward it. One more thing. I'm only 33 minutes over, whatever. The truth of things finally revealed to Isabel Archer is the huge power of circumstances in shaping and directing one's life, especially a woman's life. Even a woman such as Isabel Archer, so richly equipped with personal talents and spiritual gifts, and provided by life with the best of social and economic opportunities, is finally unable, regardless of how we decide to read the novel's ending, to escape that power. By staging the American transcendentalist as a woman character and a woman character as the transcendentalist American, Henry James is offering a critique of both Emersonian self-reliance in its more simplistic, chauvinistic versions, and the specific gender constraints thwarting women's potential as individuals. powerful revisionary version of the courtship novel in the English language tradition. The Portrait of a Lady endows it with a new intellectual edge, subverting the ideological import of this hackneyed genre. So we don't have a nice and tidy ending. We don't have the satisfaction of knowing that Isabel will escape Osmond. But we think that if she goes back to Osmond, which she seems to be doing, she does so having been loved. We just learned that. And she still has the gift of the money that Ralph gave her, Ralph's father. So she has the ability to be free, and she also knows that Osmond needs her money. So she has some power in that. She also cares about Pansy, and Pansy gets the mother that she needs. So that is the end of our novel. I don't know about you, but I used to say when I finished the book in graduate school, I used to say that this was my favorite book. And while it is true that I usually think the book I'm right now teaching, I usually think that's my favorite. I do think this is my favorite of favorites. It's just brilliant. So with that, we can close. I anticipate that many of you will be back in January when we start a new book. I don't even know what we're not doing. I don't think we've determined it yet. But for all of that, it was nice everybody was here. Have a nice holiday season because Thanksgiving is coming and then the holidays after that. So enjoy that and be safe, and I will talk to you then.